In this video, we will walk through how to properly consume a REST API resource that requires OAuth 2.0 authorization protocol using OPC Router. You will learn the proper procedure for obtaining authorization from a web service, as well as how to utilize the resulting authorization token to securely access and consume resources within the same web service. By following along with this tutorial, you'll gain valuable insights into effectively leveraging OPC Router for secure and efficient integration with RESTful APIs. Let us begin by briefly discussing what is it that we will need to be able to consume a resource from a REST web service that requires client credentials, grant type authorization to access these resources. First, we will need a REST web service. In this exercise, we will be using Spotify web services. Please note that the focus of this exercise is to learn how to properly authorize and securely consume a RESTful API. So using a web service like Spotify will allow us to see the proper mechanics on how to achieve this with any other REST API that requires this type of authorization. We also need a well-documented REST API. In this case, Spotify is. Next, we'll need the client credentials and authorization schema for the web service. This will be the client ID, client secret, as well as any other parameter that will need to be passed to the REST authorization endpoint in order to get authorization. Third, we will need OPC Router on a system that has a network path to the web service. In our example, Spotify is accessible via the public internet, so we just need an OPC Router on a system that has internet access. It is important to mention this since we are well aware that in an industry, public access is a no-go from a security perspective. So one will need to make sure that a network path can be established between the system running OPC Router and the web servers that one is trying to consume. Lastly, we need just a few minutes to be able to configure this in OPC Router. Alright, let's begin by looking at our web service documentation. First, we would like to see how to get OPC Router authorized. And second, what resources does the web service have available so that we can test once we're authorized. If we take a look at the Spotify documentation, we can clearly see how simple it is to get our authorization token. We see that the HTTP method is a post, the host and resource that is going to authorize OPC Router. We got our header parameter for content type, and we got our query parameters. And once we properly configure the REST client and call upon the token resource, this is going to be the expected response. Now, let's pick a simple resource to consume so that we can test our authorization token. Let's go to Artists and select Get Artists Top Tracks. According to documentation, here's how we get an artist's top tracks in a specific region. We'll need to pass an artist ID and a market query parameter. I already went ahead and found the ID of one of my favorite composers, Antonio Vivaldi, and the market is going to be US. Alright, now it is time for us to configure the connection in OPC Router. As we saw in the documentation, the web service host URL for the authorization was different than the web service resource host URL. So let's go ahead and configure the plugin for both connections. Let's go to Plugins, REST Plugin, add a new REST connection. Let's give it a name, Spotify authorization. Enter the host URL. Authentication, we leave it alone. It is important to remember that OAuth 2.0 is not an authentication protocol, but rather an authorization protocol. Since we're looking to get authorization, we do not need to configure any authentication. Now, let's click on OK. Next, let's add the connection for a web service host that has access to all resources we're looking to consume. In a similar way, let's add a new REST connection add a name, Spotify main, leave authentication at none, just like we did with the other connection. And now let's click on OK. Now that we have both of our REST connections configured, let's go over the connection tab and start constructing out the connection flow. We'll begin with the authorization flow. Let's create a folder. Now we add the first connection, which we call get token. Let's add the REST transfer object to our connection flow and configure it. Select the connection for authorization. Let's add the endpoint that we need to call, which is API token. Let's select our HTTP method, which is post. Let's enter the format. And now let's enter the parameters. First parameter is going to be grant type, client ID, and client secret. You can test the connection here, but for this exercise we will skip this part. Let's add the values to the request parameters. Since the response is going to be a JSON payload, let's add a JSON read transfer object. Enter the format of the JSON payload we're expecting. We only care about the token, so let's read only the token. Now let's pass the value onto a global variable within OPC Router. Finally, let's configure our trigger. Since the token expires every hour, we can make it simple by configuring a time trigger that refreshes the token every 59 minutes. Now, let's create another connection flow where we can use the token to access a specific resource. First, we will need the token that we got from the authorization connection, and we can do so by accessing that global variable. Now, we need to pass the token with a token type which is bearer. We can easily do this by using a text replace transfer object. Now, let's configure the REST transfer object. Select the Spotify main connection. Enter the endpoint that we are after. In this case, we would like to pass the artist ID dynamically, so we can create a URL parameter by using curly brackets. The HTTP method is get, and now we configure the authorization parameter for our header and the query parameter for the market. Since I'm located in the US, I will configure the default value to always be US instead of passing it every time the connection gets triggered. Now let's pass the artist ID for the composer Vivaldi, and let's pass the authorization value. Finally, we can either pass the response body to a variable, but I am choosing to write it to a JSON file in a local folder. We can send the status code and text to a local variable. Go productive and publish the changes. And now let's trigger the connection manually. As we can see, we successfully got access from the web service after getting an authorization token. We can go and inspect the JSON payload for the response, and we can see that it contains the expected information from the artist. As you witnessed, accessing REST web services that requires OAuth 2.0 authorization protocol through OPC Router is a breeze. Now you can effortlessly follow similar steps to integrate your own REST web service using OPC Router. If something was not clear or you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us.